Endwalker's 2-minute burst meta strategy. Is it a problem? And if so, why? Let's talk about that, but first, just so that everyone is on the same page, let's briefly go over what exactly the 2-minute burst meta is. There has always been an advantage to stacking as many damage buffs as possible. Using two 10% damage buffs for 15 seconds equates to a combined 21% damage increase due to multiplicative stacking, which is always better than having 10% more damage for 30 seconds by using them in extension of each other. This is both because stacking them leads to a higher damage bonus, but also because most jobs have a limited amount of powerful attacks that they could easily fit within the 15-second interval anyway, making the most of each attack. Before Endwalker, however, a lot of these kinds of raid-wide buffs had really awkward cooldowns and durations to overlap with each other. Let's say you had a ninja, a monk, a dancer, and a summoner in your group back in Shadowbringers. Then, naturally, the buffs they provided all stacked together in the opener. However, after that, you would have a handful of random buff windows, simply because holding them wasn't really worth it. Meaning you had Trick Attack at 1 minute, Brotherhood at 1.5 minutes, Trick Attack and Technical Finish at 2 minutes, Brotherhood, Trick Attack and Ether Pact, just think Searing Light, at 3 minutes, Trick Attack and Technical Finish at 4 minutes, Brotherhood at 4.5 minutes, and Trick Attack at 5 minutes. And then, at 6 minutes, you had Trick Attack, Brotherhood, Technical Finish, and Ether Pact. But if anything caused the slightest delay or adjustment on any of these buffs, it was likely that by 6 minutes they weren't really lining up that well anymore anyway. In Endwalker, all raid buffs have been changed to 2-minute cooldowns, meaning that they all align perfectly in the opener and every 2 minutes. In terms of practicality and ease of use, this is just generally a big win. However, this convenience has had a lot of knock-on effects elsewhere in the game. When performing an optimized opener and rotation in Endwalker, most jobs will hold their big damage buttons for around 7 seconds or so, with a few exceptions, because all the optimized openers are coordinated to make sure their raid buffs overlap in the time frame of around 7 seconds into the fight to around 22 seconds in. Why is that? The shortest raid buffs last 15 seconds, with some among them lasting 20, and then Summoner's Searing Light lasting 30. As such, to make the most of the raid buffs, the target is to have them all overlap for 15 seconds, given the multiplicative stacking I mentioned earlier. Normally, a few select jobs would be particularly interested in doing their damage in one big burst every so often, but with this meta playstyle, all jobs technically have a 15-second window where they do more damage, regardless of whether the job itself has one. This leads to all jobs focusing on a stockpile and burst style rotation wherever possible. You might be thinking, right, so because everyone gets to do 5% more damage in a 15-second window, this is suddenly a problem? Really? But the problem isn't the individual buffs, it is in the multiplicative stacking. If you had a group consisting of an astrologian, a scholar, a bard, a red mage, a dragoon, a ninja, and 2 random tanks, then your raid-wide buffs would look like this. 5% damage from astrologian, 5% damage from red mage, 5% damage from ninja, 6% damage from bard, 20% direct hit from bard, 2% crit from bard, 10% crit chance from dragoon, and 10% crit chance from scholar. When we add all this together, we get 22.71% more damage from just the damage buffs. 20% direct hit is worth around 5% more damage as well, although it can be a bit less depending on gear. This leads to 28.8%. The combined 22% crit chance is at least 8.8% more damage. But given that most best in slot sets optimize around crit, it is possible that players are getting 63% or more damage out of crits, making 22% chance worth 13.86% more damage. This leads to a combined 46.7% more damage done for 15 seconds, on average. And that doesn't include the fact that Dragoon and Astrologian have some personal buffs to hand out as well. Considering the jobs that are normally expected to attack in bursts, like Gunbreaker and Paladin, tend to have at most a 20 or 25% damage buff to motivate them, realizing that certain group compositions can double that with good coordination, that can certainly cause some balancing issues in the game. Now then, why is it really a problem? Isn't being able to do big damage just fun and good all around? Well, yes and no. The good side is that because aligning raid buffs is relatively straightforward nowadays, most groups should be capable of doing it if they so desire. In fact, in anything outside casual difficulty content, it should almost be expected that people do it, given how approachable it is to align your raid buffs, right? It would almost be weird if the buffs don't align when they are served up so clearly and easily. And that is where the problems start. Let me pose an example. Let's say that Paladin's fight or flight was changed to last 40 seconds instead of just 20, and let's say, just for the sake of the example, that you were given more good attacks to fill into this buff to make it interesting. This would, however, mean that fight or flight would only be down for 20 seconds. At first, it might be really cool that you can just keep going, and sure, those 20 seconds of downtime would be a bit awkward, but as the new sparkle of having twice as much burst as you had before starts to wane, it changes from being awesome to have 40 seconds of burst time to being annoying that you have 20 seconds of downtime. It is somewhat comparable to hit chance in games. With hit chance, you could, for example, be hitting the target for damage 90% of the time, but 10% of the time you do 0 damage. That sucks. With direct hit, 90% of the time you do damage and 10% of the time you do more damage. Having a high amount of normal, sometimes interrupted with something bad or annoying, like missing, is worse than having a high amount of normal, sometimes interrupted with something good. Given that aligning raid buffs is relatively easy when they all have a 2-minute cooldown, and there are many resources available to get taught the optimized openers, it is somewhat reasonable to view aligning raid buffs as a given in non-casual content. By it being assumed to always happen, it changes from being exciting when it does happen to becoming annoying when it doesn't. You go from having the "wow, look at all these buffs" reaction to seeing all the raid buffs aligned, gradually changing to perhaps thinking, just as expected, now we can finally play the game. It turns something that should be awesome and exciting into something mundane that is more likely to cause strife when it doesn't happen. Imagine if the Paladin's fight or flight just sometimes didn't activate. That is how raid buffs can end up feeling. But with the social aspect covered, there are two other example problems caused by the 2-minute burst meta. The first of which is in relation to gearing and stats. We can probably agree that the substats in Final Fantasy XIV, crit, determination, direct hit, speed, tenacity and piety are really boring. Well, to be fair, speed, tenacity and piety are somewhat interesting in each their own way. The 2-minute burst meta heavily favors anything that increases the damage of any job's cooldowns. Notably, speed and piety doesn't really do that. And while tenacity does, the fact that it does so around 29% worse than determination means that determination is favored far more by the 2-minute burst meta. This has led to a lot of jobs that simply don't care for speed because getting slightly more damage while you do close to 50% more damage is just better. Possibly the best example of this gradual evolution is the Black Mage, who used to always be known as the speed demon that stacked as much spell speed as possible. But as Endwalker has evolved, Black Mage's burst damage, especially through Xenoglossy, has been boosted a lot, and this combined with strategies to maximize the damage done in the 2-minute burst window, has made a slower, more bursty Black Mage build, the Slow Mage or Crit Mage, a lot more favored. This is both because it has a higher capacity to do more damage, given damage variance and luck, but also because due to the advantages presented by the 2-minute burst meta, the average performance of a Crit Mage is ever so slightly above the average and far more consistent performance of a Fast Mage build. Yes, the massive buffs to attacks like Xenoglossy isn't directly related to the 2-minute burst meta, and probably would have similar effects regardless, but it certainly isn't helping. For tenacity, the core problem for it is that due to all the damage buffs, gaining damage output just outweighs reducing damage taken. Combine this with the fact that in a raid team, the group as a whole tends to have so many cooldowns that if you needed an extra 5 or 10% damage reduction to live something, someone is certain to have it to give you. You do not need to lose damage to do that. The game plan of a boss fight is to push out as much damage as you can onto the enemy, and you can only do so much. Meanwhile, you only need to use your defensive tools when they are required, meaning that it isn't unlikely to see defensive cooldowns just sitting there collecting dust at times. Imagine if a boss fight had the amount of sustained tank damage that a large wall-to-wall pull applies, where you might have to cycle through defensive cooldowns just to stay afloat. If a boss fight was like that from start to finish, then Tenacity might be more useful to let you save some cooldowns. But as the bottleneck in a boss fight these days isn't defensive cooldowns, but damage output, Tenacity is simply viewed as worse. Naturally, Piety is great when you need MP, but similarly to Tenacity, it is simply not that common for MP to be the bottleneck or an issue. But when it is good. The point I'm trying to make is that the 2-minute burst meta puts such a massive emphasis on maximizing damage that it mutes the effectiveness or helpfulness of any stat that isn't entirely dedicated to specifically making damage number bigger. And the second problem is that the 2-minute burst meta limits game design. As long as there is a 15-second window every 2 minutes where your group can do upwards of 40% or more extra damage, any job that isn't capable of putting together a big burst simply can't be viable. Some may recall that in the very first raid tier of Endwalker, Paladin was at such a massive disadvantage compared to the other tanks that it was at first not even considered viable by some players. This kept being a problem until the job was completely reworked. What was wrong with Paladin? The old Paladin rotation revolved around maintaining a dot while cycling through a looping rotation. This looping rotation had around 15 seconds of downtime, followed by 25 seconds of the physical minor burst, and then 20 seconds of the magical major burst. This caused issues because by construction, to make the rotation function effectively, you needed to start with a minor burst and then the major burst. But that would mean that the major burst would never align with raid buffs. This led to degenerate, absurd strategies such as the ridiculous opener where you used Fight or Flight 18 seconds in advance so you could apply the buffed dot right at the end and then circle straight into the major burst. Fortunately, slow Paladin builds had an alternative. I spoke about this a bit in this short. But even with tactics like this, because the Paladin's damage was more spread out to focus on a more sustained approach, Paladin could not capitalize heavily enough on the 2-minute burst window to be competitive enough with the other tanks. Naturally, in a casual context, Paladin was perfectly fine. And to some degree, Paladin was only at a massive disadvantage if you wanted to clear the new Savage raid tier week 1, or you wanted to do the maximum damage possible. Aside from that, Paladin was fine, but a job being at a strict disadvantage because it isn't focused on burst is a massive problem. As long as the 2-minute burst meta exists as it does now, any job that is ever implemented in the game either needs to do an absolutely absurd amount of sustained damage, or it has to include an optimized 15-second burst every 2 minutes to be considered balanced and alright next to the rest of the lineup. To finish this discussion, I'm not here to offer a solution to the problem. Ultimately, I think the problem has festered to a degree where the only option is to either embrace it from the development side of things and see what they can make of it, or get rid of it. And by get rid of it, I mean either massively weaken raid buffs to the point where it isn't really impactful as it is today, or flat out remove all of the buffs. Why does it have to be all of them? If, say, only Dancer and Bard gets to have raid buffs, then you would still need to play around the 2-minute burst meta while a Dancer or Bard was in your group. Similarly, if you massively weakened the buffs, while it wouldn't matter as much, you would still need to make the most of the buffs for the jobs that brought the buffs to be considered worth it from an optimization standpoint. As I said, I don't know what the solution is, but I'm certainly seeing some glaring issues that seem to only get worse. Last time I spoke about the 2-minute curse, it didn't feel nearly as overwhelmingly problematic as now. But with that said, I hope you found this discussion interesting. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, at the start of Endwalker, Summoner's Searing Light was something you ordered the Carbuncle to perform. Place commands take priority over all other commands, and the pet has a memory of around 30 seconds or so. Combining these two facts made it possible to queue Searing Light, have 30 seconds of the cooldown tick, and then have the Carbuncle cast it by having it run in circles. Because of the 2-minute burst meta, this wasn't particularly helpful since it would misalign all future Searing Lights. But it is pretty funny that it was possible. This was also a carryover from the similar buff called Ether Pact and Devotion from before Endwalker.